Hey guys, good evening. Todd Sachs of Sachs Realty. I'm the real estate broker and founder here at Sachs Realty, and welcome to our fourth episode of Tuesday Night Live. Hopefully, you're going to have at least one of these in your lifetime. So, sellers, listen up and buyers beware. Tonight, we're talking about the home inspection. I have with me tonight Tim Shelton. He's with US Inspect. Tim is Executive Vice President of US Inspect, and they're a very large inspection company. And tonight, we're covering the start to finish of the home inspection. We're going to talk about the 10 big things that you should really be paying attention to, and as well as sellers, how do you get your place ready to have a magnifying glass taken all around the outside and inside of your home, the place that you've lived. And sometimes the sellers, they don't like that very much. They get really nervous about that. And we're going to make this whole process easy for you tonight. So let's jump right in because we have a lot to cover. Let's meet Tim Shelton. Tim, welcome.
Hi, Todd. Thanks for having me. I appreciate being on your show and love being part of the conversation.
I'm excited to have you here. So tell everybody a little bit about you.
So, as Todd said, my name's Tim Shelton. I'm the Executive Vice President of US Inspect, which is a national home inspection company. I also do inspections, so I get to live every day as a home inspector would live. And I have the benefit of making some wonderful decisions to help our organization grow collectively and become better every day. So it's awesome to be here and be a part of your show. And again, thank you very much for having me.
Well, again, thank you. And you're very qualified to talk about this topic. So you've been a home contractor, right?
Yeah, I've been a home inspector for 15. Yep, I've been a home inspector for 15 years. And prior to my home inspection career, I was a superintendent with a big box builder locally here and built hundreds of homes in the PG County and Southern Maryland areas. I also I would give my credit to the start of my desire to be in construction to my parents, who were the ultimate hairy homeowners. And my father lived by the rule: if it was broke, he was fixing it, and he wasn't having a stranger come into his house. So we learned together a lot of things, and that's where my whole desire to do this started.
That's awesome. So what is a home inspection?
So by definition, a home inspection is a visual, non-invasive evaluation of a home. What that means in layman's terms, it's a physical. It's no different than having your annual physical by your primary care physician. A home inspector's job is to assess the property as it stands that day. And I think there's a misconception on what the responsibility is as a home inspector, when the reality is we're there to take a very small snapshot in time of hopefully a property that'll be standing for 200 or 300 years.
Yeah, that's a great way to look at it. It is a snapshot in time. And there are a lot of different inspections. Obviously, tonight we're going to talk about the buyer's home inspection. Mm-hmm. I know on your website, you guys have a whole bunch of different inspections, and you guys are really coast to coast. And so we're not just talking about Maryland real estate here. This really applies. We're hoping that if you're buying a home, that you're getting a home inspection, and that you're represented by a great agent, a realtor, and that they are pointing you in the right direction. But let's talk about what makes a qualified inspector.
Well, it's different in states. Maryland specifically, there's a requirement for online or classroom studies. You have to take a 72-hour course, and then you have to pass a national exam, which has been put together by professionals in our industry. But if I go to Virginia, I have to take an 80-hour course and do 25 ride-alongs with a qualified inspector, plus pass the national exam. But then that's different in New Jersey. That requires even more ride-alongs and more online studies and in-classroom studies. So it really differs from area to area. But the consistent part of it is there's always a requirement to study and pass the national exam and belong to a national association that's a part of our industry.
So, Tim, I have to ask, as a real estate broker and also an agent that represents buyers and sellers in this home buying and selling process, shouldn't they have to have more experience than just a 80-hour course? I mean, should somebody selecting a home inspector for their client an agent or the buyer, shouldn't they make sure that they have some kind of construction background?
I would say yes to that, but times are changing. When I started as an inspector, it was a requirement to have a background in construction engineering or in the architect field. You couldn't get in the business without it. But over the last 10 years, with the internet and the development of online training, and I think as a society, we've just gotten smarter as a whole. I have all sorts of people on our team that with different backgrounds, from ministers to former teachers, firefighters, lawyers, doctors, you name it. It's amazing how diverse our industry has become with backgrounds. Does it help to have a background? Sure. But if you're willing to learn, I truly believe that anyone can be taught how to become a home inspector if they give it the time and the education, not only on the front end, but also the back end of your career.
Sure. So just so everybody watching, I mean, we have an audience of professionals that know this stuff, but for those of you that don't, the buyer typically pays for the home inspection. And go ahead, Tim.
About 80% of the time, that's accurate. Yeah.
Yeah. Without getting, and we'll talk much later about whether sellers should get into pre-inspections and things like that. But primarily what we deal with on a day-to-day basis is the buyer hiring an inspector, electing to have somebody that they choose come through and really do this physical, as you said. So what are the costs? So let's talk about, I mean, you guys know the whole gamut from the East to West Coast. So give us an average of what an average home inspection costs.
I would say it's somewhere between $375 and $425 for the primary service of a home inspection. Most home inspectors have ancillary products such as radon and termite and mold that drive up the price, but on average, a home inspection is going to be around that $400 mark.
Yeah. And that certainly, I mean, if you have a well or you have septic systems and things like that, I mean, obviously there's costs that are involved with that. So how long does the process typically take? So a $400 home inspection, is this a 4 or 5 hour process?
No, typically the inspection itself would take about 2.5 to 3 hours. And depending on, the contractor that you use, there could be a delay in the report delivery, or, most inspectors now will get you your report within a 24-hour time period of the inspection process, knowing that we're in a time crunch with the contingencies in the real estate world.
Yeah, and I want to say one thing before we go any further about US Inspect, and not a plug for you or your company, but years ago, I used a guy, and we've had a conversation about this. His name was Art Ike. He's passed on. He passed away a couple years ago. But anyway, I used to, refer him all the time. And you guys were like the most tech company back in the day. I remember that Art would come to the house with his laptop and his portable computer. And this is like almost 20 years ago. Right. So you guys, I just wanted to add that. It was kind of neat that so US Inspect's been around for a while. So what I want to talk about now, obviously as a broker, we know the deal killers. So, personally, I have some issues with, you say that you train people well and all that good stuff, and that the teacher or the, firefighter can be a home inspector. I have my own opinions on that as a builder myself, swinging a hammer back in 1989. I started my business. I've built houses, rehabbed houses. I've been commercial contractor forever. And, so I take it a little different, when I look at somebody saying that this or that. But the bottom line is we all in the industry, you should be recommending that somebody gets a home inspection. A couple of reasons is, number one, that buyer that is walking through that home that they're looking at, buying, number one, they're not comfortable when they're first looking at the home, because a lot of times other people live there and it's hard for them to relax and look very, objectively. They may not have ever owned a home before, so they don't know what to look for. But when the home inspector gets there, this is something that they do all the time, and they kind of settle in and really calm that buyer down, and really should act as someone that is aiding that buyer through the introduction to that home that they're purchasing. And so kind of take us through the step of what happens when the home inspector shows up?
So one of the things that you mentioned was the term deal killer, and that is a very popular term in our industry. And it's, dedicated to the inspector who is overly zealous with the communication to the problems. And I think a lot of that starts at the beginning of the inspection with what we call our driveway pitches, which when our inspectors are setting the expectation of what a home inspection is and going through the standards of practice and, a 5 or 10 minute window with the client to have an understanding of what their responsibilities are and their limitations. Because unfortunately, as much as I would love x-ray vision, I don't have it and I can't see inside the walls. So I have to allow my spidey senses, so to speak, to lead my way on how I approach certain defects that we come across. And a lot of, I think that the term deal killer is about the misleading information that might be provided. A home inspector's job is simply to point it out. It's black and white. It's there, it's right or it's wrong. It's not to go into the reasoning for the defect. As I said earlier, it's a physical. And if you go to have a physical by your doctor and you have a irregular heartbeat, you're going to see a heart specialist. And it's the same concept applies to the home inspection side of things. Now, you made a comment earlier about a background being important. And that's where I think the difference comes in is the ability to maybe go a little bit deeper and beyond the scope of what we're there to do to explain why this situation is occurring, not just point it out. You have a foundation crack because your gutters are leaking. Well, a lot of people don't look at it that way. They look at it as a foundation crack, not understanding that leaking gutters lead to expansive soil, which leads to pressure on the foundation. So, a home inspector is, I used the example earlier, a primary care physician, but the other example I love to use is a crime scene investigator. Our job is to put the pieces together to find what that crime is. And, a hair can lead to damaged, stringers on stairs, things to that extent. So, it's about education. It's about setting the expectation. It's about making sure your client has a full understanding of the process. And, the real estate professional can help us in a way of, setting that expectation before we're ever met. First-time home buyer seminars are a great way to get that information out to set the expectation. So it's about the communication. 90% of what we do is communicate, introduce the home. It's not only, hey, this is wrong with it, but it's also a lot of the good. And hey, you have a roof that's 2 years old. So as long as you do the maintenance, you're good. You should be good for another 20 years. And really having an understanding, a deep understanding of allowing the facts to lead you to the solutions to the problems.
So let's talk about the top 10. So obviously, we only have an hour to go over this stuff and, let's talk about the big items. So, I'd like to start off with, like the heating and air system, which, in this industry, we call HVAC, right? So what I'd like for you to do, Tim, is kind of, just give us an overview of what you're looking for, what a buyer should be, aware of with each one of these top 10, big items, and really what you see most of the time with these top 10. So let's start out with the heating and air system.
So I'm gonna first start off by saying there's a lot of things that go into this: age of components, locations of where you are in the country, the builders that occurred. So a lot of our decision making on how we approach our job is based off of experience and facts from other inspectors, and that's the great part about this industry, is learning from everyone else. But from an HVAC standpoint, you're looking obviously cleanliness, efficiency to the system. If I open a furnace cover and there's a fungal growth inside of it, that's going to trigger me to believe it hasn't been serviced in quite some time. And if you're a homeowner, you should service your HVAC components annually. Another large factor with the HVACs is the distribution. If you're dealing with a water boiler radiator, for instance, air is one of the biggest problems. The radiators fill up with air. They don't heat completely, which limits the efficiency of the system. In a forced air system, you have ductwork that supplies registers, and In the 80s, there was ductwork that was manufactured that has a deficiency in the vapor barrier, where they placed this flexible material in an attic thinking that this plastic was going to protect it from heat, and the plastic failed in the heat. In certain areas where we live here in Maryland, subgrade ductwork has been known to have environmental contaminants such as asbestos as part of the insulation. So the primary goal here is to make sure that the distribution and the efficiency of the system is operating as the way the manufacturer designed it, and maintenance is the key to that whole thing. Electrical is another big issue that we come across. Again, in the 70s, we know there were multiple manufacturers that made electrical panels that were deficient and don't work. So it's about, again, that's where the education side come in to know those products. And then you deal with, houses built in the 70s that may have single strand aluminum wiring because of, at the time the war was consuming all the copper for the equipment for what was going on overseas. Most common in the electrical, I would probably say, is open grounded outlets or improper use of GFCI protection devices. And nowadays, a lot of it is involved with smoke detectors and carbon monoxide detectors because of the recent changes to our regulations in the industry.
How do you deal with what appears to be, homeowner electrical work? So, maybe things that are wired incorrectly, or things that, when you're dealing with outlets that don't work and things like that. So, are you checking every single outlet in the house?
No, it's, in a vacant house, I would say yes. We're going to put our hands on everything we can put our hands on. But in a house that's occupied, I'm not allowed to move furniture. I'm not allowed to, open up blinds and drapery if it's closed to certain extents. I have limitations. So we try to do a sample amount that's relevant to the property. So if I walk into a room and there's, 2 or 3 visible outlets, but I know there's 6 in the room, I'm going to hit those 3 visible outlets. I'm going to do the top and bottom fixture to make sure that they're wired correctly in both ways. If I come across a defect, again, it's going to be a recommendation to a qualified contractor to make the repair. But, hairy homeowner electrical fixtures, they don't bother me if they're done properly. I've known plenty of hairy homeowners that were smarter than I am. And I go to their home and I look, they invite me over, they ask me to look at their work to make sure it's done correctly, and there's no issues with it. And the same rule applies with a property that may have been renovated where permits weren't pulled. Another big item that we deal with is plumbing, obviously the major components in a house. So again, in the 70s and 80s, up into the early 90s, you had products that have recalls on them, such as polybutylene. But, for the most part in the plumbing world, it's leaks. It's self-sealed leaks due to failure to improperly installed glued plastic products, or just pinhole leaks and copper products due to acidity in the water, failed water heaters that aren't heating properly, or people that have their water heater turned up too high, and a scalding safety concern for a child may exist.
So with a water heater, the average is what, 7 years, 7 to 10 years?
7 to 10 years typically. Yeah. And
So-
that varies and differs if you're on a well system, because if the well water has high or low pH balance, it can wear out the interior components to that system much quicker.
So when you're telling people that their water heaters, towards end of life, how do you guys handle stuff like that? Do you recommend that they replace it right away? What are you telling people when they have a 10-year-old water heater?
I like to use the term, grandma's old and we don't throw her away.
Okay.
Just because it's old doesn't mean it doesn't work. I think the oldest water heater I saw in operation was over 40 years old. Good old
Wow.
Montgomery Ward's water heater. So, we don't make things like we used to. However, maintenance and the understanding of how to extend the life expectancy of that water heater, such as draining it annually to get the sediment out, is a big conversation piece during a home inspection.
So you're telling people to drain their water heater every single year?
You should drain your water heater annually. And, there's an argument in the plumbing world where, what if the valve goes bad? Because, we don't operate valves in a home inspection. it's part of the standards of practice. Well, I would much rather have to replace a valve once a year than a water heater every 3 or 4 years. The cost is significantly different between the two, and it's just part of part of the maintenance on a home that a lot of people aren't aware of. Another large factor is roofing material. And, the biggest common defects that we come across are usually related to ventilation or improper ventilation to the attic, which drives up temperatures in the attic, which cooks the asphalt or rubber materials quicker than they're supposed to. Installation of the material being done improperly, the use of the improper starter courses or drip edge flashing, which is a requirement in installs for roof. Now, we come across that stuff all the time, not being the way the manufacturer recommends it. And that's how a home inspector thinks. We're not there to look at the code side of the world, although most home inspectors know code. We're there to look at the manufacturer recommendations to their product to make sure their product was installed and being used properly.
That's a great point, which a lot of times the building inspectors at the county level, they're not looking at that, right?
Right. Correct.
I mean, they want to make sure that the framing is passed inspection, or that, all the, big components meet code, but they have no clue as the manufacturer recommendation. So that's interesting.
And that's a part of the education on the back end of the home inspection license. Once you get it, you have to continue to do education. We're required to do a minimum of 15 hours annually, and that has to be in a classroom setting.
And that's more than we do. And as a real estate licensee, I like that. I like 15 hours every year.
Yeah, it's just part of staying up with the changing technology. Now we have houses that you can talk to the toilet and make it flush. That wasn't around 10 years ago when Art was writing his
smart
reports.
Toilet.
That's right.
How about toilets? I mean, I hear all the time about them being loose, and do the bolts? Is that a problem a lot of the times with the bolts that bolt down the actual toilet to the floor?
Well, most toilets that are loose weren't installed properly to begin with. They were installed, they weren't compressed down around the wax ring, and the bolts weren't tightened properly. So the first time somebody sits on it and that half-inch compression to the wax ring occurs, you have a loose toilet from day one. And that's why it's so important to do the rock test, as we call it. You stand over top of it and you rock it back and forth to make sure that there's no significant movement. There should occasionally be some slight movement. You don't want it to be so tight to the floor it cracks the tile or anything like that. But all in all, there's certain resistance we want to feel as an inspector to make sure there's no potential moisture leaking below that toilet,
which could lead to rot,
subflooring rot, fungal growth, wood destroying insect infestation. I mean, moisture is probably the biggest problem in the house because it has so many causes to the effect on the back end of it, foundation deterioration, so on and so forth. Radon, I keep mentioning environmental concerns. Radon is becoming more and more popular. I know Montgomery County is one of the first counties in the United States to require it as part of the real estate transaction. And that's because we're becoming more educated on the concerns behind radon.
You see lobbying for that everywhere in the U.S.
Yeah,
is radon, at least where basements are prevalent, right? Where you have basements?
Yes, but there are many slab on grade properties just in the Columbia area here in Maryland that we detect radon. It's a pressure issue. It's a soil condition that we have. The beauty of Maryland is we have it all. We have 4 seasons, actual seasons, and we have frosting and heaving that occurs, and that opens up so many potential channels for that radon gas to enter into your home. That's why the EPA recommends testing every 2 years, regardless if you have an operating system in your property or not. But I think the biggest misconception on radon is that radon gas is bad for you. Radon gas actually isn't bad for you. It's the decay products that the radon gas produces that is what's harmful to the human body. And those are metals and radioactive materials such as plutonium and uranium.
Where do you find those? Where are they?
They're floating around in the air attached to the dust particles that you have in the house. Radon comes in 2 forms, what we call plated radon particles that are attached to your furniture, to your walls, that are no longer a concern to you. But it's unplated radon is what ends up leading to the second cause of lung cancer in the United States. And those particles attach to the dust that's floating around in your house, and you breathe it in, and then the alteration to the lung cell starts to occur.
So what they used to say about you only had to be concerned with radon in the basement, you're saying is not the case. And so,
Right.
what we used to hear was, geez, like we're living in the basement full time, like we work and things like that. It's not like we don't come out of the house, but you're saying it really is a hazard.
It is. When radon was first discovered, the heating systems in the house were fireplaces and boilers. And now that we have forced air systems, which are usually located in our basement with a return register, we're now taking those decay products and we're moving them around the house. And that's why having such a good, efficient air filtration system in your house is so important to capture a lot of that decay product that's floating around.
Tim, would you say everyone should have a radon test?
I would say yes, but you can go to the EPA.gov website, and they have a chart on the website of the concern areas all over the country. You can actually see, as a radon testing professional, we have to send some of those results to the EPA so that they can create a tracking mechanism of where these concern
High
areas
levels
are found. Right. So the further south you go in Maryland, the less likely you are to have a radon issue, because radon, we know, comes from rock decay. And as we get closer to the Appalachians in Western Maryland, that's where you see some of the largest. So I actually had a radon test in Westminster 10 years ago that tested at 278 picocuries in a home. And it was a slab on grade house.
So give us, so that everybody understands. So give us what is tolerable or acceptable and what isn't. What's that threshold?
There's no acceptable level according to the EPA, and what they base it off of is your annual exposure to radioactive material. So the EPA recommends that you live in a property with a radon level below 4.0 picocuries per liter. And so, in the state of Maryland, the average is between 2 and 6. In some locations. But again, if the further north you go, those averages can jump to 20 or 30 picocuries. And, great for the building industry to start to recognize that. I was lucky enough, as you mentioned earlier, to be a builder for many years before I started as an inspector. And I got to see the evolution of construction to include vapor barriers and systems to control radon entry into your house, which started in the late 90s. So most properties after the late 90s, you have some type of protection. However, you can't control physics. We just had an earthquake a few years ago that created new fault lines and cracks in the soil that could deliver radon gas through pressure into your home, through everyday changes. So yes, everybody should have a radon test every 2 years. You can have a professional who's qualified to do it, or you can go to Lowe's and buy the $30 testing kit at Lowe's. And as long as you follow the directions properly, they're just as accurate as having somebody come into your property with a actual continuous monitor to do an inspection.
And you're really recommending mitigation, what? Anything over 4? Is that what you guys?
4.0 is where they recommend. Now,
Right.
If your house comes back at 3.9, we're going to recommend that you do another test. And when that test results come back in, we're going to take the average of the two, and we're going to see where you lie at that point.
And just so that because this is a big concern of yours, and anything that's a big concern of yours should be a big concern of really everybody that is, living in a home. How do they mitigate that?
So essentially what they do is they put a depressurization system under the slab, and that can include tying into your existing sump pump if you have one, or what they'll do is core drill a hole through your concrete slab, dig a pit, fill it with wash gravel that's, that can filter the gas through the soil, put an open-ended pipe into the soil, and then run a pipe from the basement to what should be about a foot above the roof line, either on the inside or outside of the house. And then there's a depressurization fan that essentially sucks the radon contaminants from the lower level of the house and distributes it to the outside. But there's more benefits to just installing a radon remediation system than just clearing radon. Most properties that have a radon remediation system actually have lower moisture contents in their basement as well, because of the removal of the condensation below grade. So there's multiple benefits for having the $1,200 to $1,500 system installed in your house.
Yeah. So that was the next question, about 12 or 1,500 to have that installed. Great. And we'll see. I mean, you're right. Montgomery County requires the sellers to provide that radon test, and we'll probably see more of it.
I would imagine it's going to spread. I've heard
Yeah.
Frederick and Carroll County have that discussions in litigation or in legislation right now.
Yeah. All right, let's talk about the next big one.
Yeah, the scary four-letter word we know is mold, and
Yes.
you will not find many home inspectors that'll say that word because we're not legally allowed to. We have to refer to it as potential fungal growth or potential mold growth. Unless there is an actual test that's going on right there at site, we can't say that word. That's a very, very bad word to a home inspector. So what we try to obviously have people understand is that you wouldn't have a mold problem if you didn't have a moisture problem. So we want to figure out what the problem is that's turning into the mold before we attack the remediation side of the mold. A home inspector, if they comes in and they take a good home inspector will take moisture readings around the perimeter of the basement every 4 or 5 feet with their moisture meter. Some home inspectors use thermal imaging as part of their inspection process to detect moisture, which is becoming more and more popular in our industry. But your reaction to mold in your property is going to be different than my reaction. So there is no action level for mold. The way that mold is tested and determined to be considered to be dangerous to a home is there more mold in the inside of the property than there is on the outside of the property, because that's where the mold comes from. Every time I open the door, there's a pressure change and mold spores come flying in. It's, do they have the proper living conditions to grow and expand while they're in my house to allow for a fungal problem in the lower level or in the attic, for that matter, because we find it in both sides, the top and bottom of the house. Two different concern levels from a health standpoint. But regardless, mold is living on the cellulose material and causing destruction. And that's why we want it out of the house, outside of the safety concerns associated with the children or people that are living in the property.
So when you see where there's potential water penetration or moisture, do you automatically recommend that the buyer ask for a mold test?
No, not necessarily.
So what are the indicators that? Yeah, go ahead. So what are the indications that cause for that?
So the industry as a whole considers mold to be a problem when it's more than, I believe it's 10 square feet of mold. So, a pretty large area of mold that's visible. Occasionally we'll come into a property and find a speck here or a speck there, and it's on the surface of drywall maybe because something splattered on there and the conditions were just, humid enough during the summer to develop an issue. But from an action standpoint, when remediation comes in, it's at 10 square feet of visible mold in a property. Anything outside of that, a crawl space, there's not a crawl space I've ever been into where I didn't find mold. It's a damp, wet rainforest essentially under your house that only people like me go into because you pay me to do it. And,
do you find where it collects in the ductwork? I mean, I've
Absolutely.
seen where inspectors will take maybe the register off and kind of put their hand up within that ductwork and see what they feel or what they can see. Is that a good collecting spot for it?
Absolutely. Perfect example. I just had one of those situations happen 2 weeks ago to me. I was down in Southern Maryland, a house on a crawl space where they had put their HVAC system in the crawl space to save space in the living part. A lot of moisture in the lower level, visible fungal growth throughout the entire crawl space. I pulled the cover of the furnace off, visible mold inside there. I went around the house, and even on the second level of the house, when I removed the registers, there was visible growth inside the registers because that's a damp, wet, dark location, which is perfect, growth area for fungus.
Now, is that like the worst case scenario because now it's carrying it through the entire home?
Yep. That's exactly right. Same scenario that I applied to the radon conversation is you have this system now, which is delivering mold spores around the property to the baby's room, to your room while you sleep, which obviously under the right moisture conditions, 55% relative humidity can stay there and flourish in your carpet, in your drywall, on your back of your dresser. Mold doesn't have a preferred place to live. It attaches to wherever it's most convenient.
And you can also get a typical or standard mold test kit at the
Yeah, but those
home improvement store.
in most cases, those are direct sample kits where you're taking a swab off a wall. A good mold test is going to include an air quality test, which is a machine that essentially, we call it sniff and grab. It's pulling in air through a pump system, attaching any potential particles to a laminate, piece of material that is then sent to the lab and put under conditions to cure and let it grow so they can determine, what type of mold it is, from penicillin to, you name it. I mean, there's, I think,
the bad stuff, right?
A thousand different types of mold out there, and 500 are good for you and 500 are bad for you.
Well, it sounds like besides radon, everybody should have a mold test. I mean, I'm
Not
certainly, man, I'm going
necessarily.
to be, talking to you shortly after this, man. We're going to be ordering up some tests for the old house. All right, so let's move along. Let's talk about, so as a contractor, the next one's termites.
Right.
So I always say there's three types of homes, right? There's houses that have termites, houses that had termites, and houses that will have
That's right.
termites. So you, of course, know that as well. So what are we seeing with termites?
Well, I'm lucky enough to have a pesticide applicator's license, so I have a much deeper appreciation for what I call Mother Nature's garbage disposal. We need termites to eat the fallen leaves and the sticks that come off the trees so that we don't experience things that are going on in California right now. It's part of Mother Nature's cleaning process. Unfortunately, when we started building houses out of those same dead tree products, we attracted them to our properties. Termites typically always, the first place they love to build their nest, so to speak, is on what we call backfilled concrete slabs. So your front stoop, your driveway area. And the reason for that is in the home construction process, there's quite a bit of construction debris that gets left behind and poured, underneath of that concrete slab, which then produces perfect conditions. The concrete slab is going to have moisture associated with it all the time from sweating. And then I have, a cellulose product that's in the decay mode that is a buffet for termites. We don't help ourselves out as homeowners very frequently when we add mulch to our house. It's a buffet for termites. Most mulch that you buy at a local big box hardware store is only going to have a chemical resistance for a few months. And then when you add more mulch to old mulch, you create a conducive condition for wood destroying insects, not just termites, but carpenter ants. They do the same type of damage. They just use the material differently. Termites turn that wood into sugar, and carpenter ants are using that wood to create a nest. But the destructive process is the same. And, it's about the education side. And you'll hear me consistently say water control. It all comes back to water and controlling the water, because if you have dry conditions around your house, you won't have conditions for termites to want to live around your house. Although going through the studies, a termite will travel up to 300 yards away from their colony. So it's just about the pheromones that the hunters, so to speak, leave behind to allow everybody else to follow them to that buffet in your front yard of 10-year-old mulch that you continue to add to.
So, and as there, when do you get into an inspection where you recommend? I mean, I know with, I've seen houses where you take the drywall off and you could literally grab the 2x4s with your hand and turn it into dust.
Yep.
I mean, at what point, because you're not seeing behind the drywall, at what point do you recommend that they have infrared imaging, on certain walls?
Well, it's a very new product to our industry. I mean, I'm biased, but I would tell you everybody should have their home inspected annually. Maintenance is the number one cause of failure in a home. The lack of maintenance, the lack of service, the lack of changing your oil in your car engine. We wouldn't drive our car around 20,000 miles without changing the oil, but we seem to do that with our furnace and our air compressor and our water heater and the products in our house. So it really comes down to the maintenance and understanding of what's going to draw that concern or issue to your home and how to combat it before it ever happens. And a good home inspector will educate you on that throughout the process. Hey, extend your downspout away 3 or 4 feet so that the soil next to your house is dry, and maybe the termites will stay at that stump of that dead tree that was cut down 20 years ago, or grind that stump up so that it doesn't become a problem a couple years down the road. So it's all about the education side to controlling the insects. But like you said, the reality is if your house doesn't have termites, it will, because they're by design there to eat the 2x4 stud that's in your wall.
Sure. All right, so let's talk about decks, because I see a lot of times now where, the inspectors are coming out and, there's no flashing, where the deck's attached to the house. So talk about that a little bit.
So I'm going to first start off by saying if your deck wasn't built in the last 4 years, it's not built to today's standards. And the reasoning behind that is we didn't really have deck standards until around 2014. Uncle Joe would come over and build you a deck because you needed a deck, not knowing that the frost freeze line in the state of Maryland was 32 inches. And if we didn't get that foot or below there, our deck was going to be wavy in 2 years. So what we do at US Inspect is we are members of associations that provide continual education, not only how to build a deck, but the proper material that should be used when building a deck. In most cases, like I said, if the deck's more than 4 years old, there's going to be issues that a home inspector is going to point out. Flashing, a secondary support post adjacent to the house. One of the most common things that we come across on houses with cantilevers is the deck is attached directly to the band joist, which isn't a support portion of the house. It's just a band joist. So I think the statistics out there is 80% of decks that are currently in use are a safety concern to the deck building industry. Samsung, the hardware producers want to see galvanized steel hangers, not roof nails, and toenailing is not acceptable anymore. You have to use some type of hardware in order to achieve a good, strong bond to the material.
So chances are the inspectors they're going to be looking at these decks. If they haven't been built in the last 4 years, they're going to have a problem with it or recommend some type of safety correction.
Right. Yeah. And that goes not only on the structure side, but on the cosmetic side too. When composite material first came out in the early 2000s, we installed it by screwing it down from the top. The whole time the manufacturer wanted you to install it from screwing it from the bottom up, not knowing that when we put that screw in there, come the first hard freeze and water expansion occurs, that crack goes from a fraction of an inch to 3 or 4 inches long. So it's about, again, going back to what the manufacturer recommends being the best practice for their product.
So the last two items we're going to talk about really don't pertain to everybody, but let's just touch on them because I know that you guys, cover it all. So let's kind of talk about wells and some of the concerns and, what buyers should be looking out for.
With wells, the number one concern is the quality of the water. Again, the quality from a bacteria standpoint, which could be harmful to the individuals living in the house. But more importantly, the pH, the acidity of the water can cause so much damage in your property, from eroding your supply and drain pipes if you live in an older home with, say, possible cast iron or copper drain pipes, to your water heater fixtures, to the shower head fixtures. There's so much sediment and minerals in well water. It has to be filtered. It has to have, salt injections for hard water purposes and chlorinator injections to kill bacteria and sulfur smells. The rotten egg smell we smell when we start running that water, that's a sulfur that is in there usually. And, there's UV lights for bacteria. There's all sorts of ways to control water. But I still see to this day houses that are drinking water directly out of the ground with no type of protection. And eventually their body's going to let them know when there's a bacterial issue with that water when they get sick. And, it's recommended that you test your well water annually, that you have a professional come out and actually put a dipstick in it to check the pH balance, to take a sample and send it to a lab to have it checked for high bacteria or Legionella, things that will make us sick. On the back end side of that, you have to deal with the septic system. They're kind of each in the same. US Inspect does not do well in septic. We have a wonderful partner that we sub that out to, who we trust tremendously, have worked with for years, who think they do a wonderful job and support our clients the same way that we do. And we leave that to the professional, because like you said, we're home inspectors. I can tell you the functionality of how a well and septic system works, but I don't want to pull that cover and look down in there 2 or 3 times a day. I'd rather be on the other end flushing the toilet.
So what are the big things you see with septic systems failing?
Well, again, the lack of maintenance. You're supposed to pump your septic. Well, and there's an argument about pumping septic systems. Some people say you never have to pump your septic systems if the bacteria inside of it is doing its job and breaking down the solids. I live on well and septic. I have my septic system pumped every 2 years. And with little kids, there's cars, there's boats, there's airplanes, there's things in there that shouldn't be in there, which can cause clogs to your baffle systems, which will then lead to problems with leaching into the drain fields from material that shouldn't be in there. The drain fields are for liquid, not for solids. And occasionally the baffling system will fail, or the tank will become unlevel due to, most of the time, water or improper installation. I've seen situations. I had a house one time where they actually did an addition to the property and used the concrete septic system as a footer for a 6x6 post. And obviously that ended up cracking the tank. There was a significant issue. They had to relocate the entire septic system to accommodate the addition of the house, which, the person that bought it, thank goodness we found it, because that was a $50,000 problem if it wasn't caught potentially. The septic system fails, the addition fails with it. So yeah, it's clogged baffles probably are the main thing. Failed drain fields, just due from age. There's a number of minor concerns that go along with it, the height of certain aspects when it comes to the septic system. But more importantly, you have multiple types of septic systems, available. You have your traditional, and then you have what the BAT technology, the best available technology, which is required if you live within 1,000 feet of the water tide here in Maryland, which is a completely different type of system altogether. And the fact that there's pumps and air injections that go into the tanks that allow the bacteria to break down much quicker. However, it costs money. And if your power goes out, you can't flush your toilets and you can't use your septic system because it won't allow you to feed the system and the drain fields properly.
Yeah, so there's your top 10, guys. So if you welcome to home ownership. So a lot of it, when you're buying a home, an inspector like Tim or any home inspector that you hire will introduce you to these things that your home may have. But these are the big items. And the reason we say they're the big items is because they're the most expensive most of the time. And they're, these 10 items, a lot of the time you can't do these yourself. The common, you may be able to put a splash block at your, downspout, but, dealing with major electrical and plumbing issues and things of that nature. I mean, these are definitely left for the experts. But I want to talk for a minute, because a lot of times, and when I earlier said that being in this industry, we deal with what we consider deal killers. Guys, if you're listening to this and you're thinking about buying, it's important to understand that this is home ownership. So, a lot of times you're buying a home, whether it's a couple years old or 30, 40 years old or older, you have to understand that the maintenance, I think what Tim really, one of the key words that he has, kind of slid in there is maintenance. You must maintain a home. And I think that when you hire a good home inspector, they're going to be able to kind of let you know whether it has had maintenance, or is it the one that has driven their car around for 20,000 miles without changing the oil. And then all of a sudden they changed it yesterday and you pull the dipstick out and it's clean. Well, a lot of times, when you dig into these things, you can tell that there has not been periodic maintenance or preventive maintenance. So, but I want you to understand that it doesn't mean that you don't go through necessarily with the purchase of the home. You have to obviously take this laundry list that your inspector may come up with and sit down and determine what are those big items that you must have or that are the deal killers, right? If you don't have this or have that, then you don't feel that you should move forward with the purchase. But you do need to save money and you do need to have money to maintain your home. But I want to talk for a minute about the seller side of things, because, and we'll skip ahead because of time. There were some other things I want to talk about, but I hear all the time, should I get a pre-listing inspection? And if you're selling a home, everybody has their own opinion on it. We're going to hear Tim's opinion, and then I'm going to give you mine. So, Tim, should a seller get a pre-inspection?
I believe so, absolutely. Statistics that were pulled directly off of the National Real Estate website tell you that if you have a pre-inspection prior to listing your home, that you're going to receive around 2% higher in commission and sell the house 20% faster. Why is that? It's because a lot of the problems that we're going to find for the buyer, we find on the front end, which gets repaired. And in a lot of instances, the conversation is much different when I walk into a house and find 10 items versus finding 50 items. Like you said, Todd, maintenance for a home inspector is a key. And, my favorite homes are houses. There's a difference between a home and a house in my world. And a house is something that you live in, that you take care of. That's a long term. And a home is typically a place that you just stay and sleep and eat and move on. My favorite houses to inspect are the 30-year homeowner that you go down there and he has every tool categorized on the wall in the basement on his pegboard. I know I'm in for a heck of a good inspection because that gentleman most likely has taken care of the maintenance side of the home. But from a business industry standpoint, I understand why the real estate professional doesn't like that, because it does open up, Pandora's box. What if we find a $10,000 problem? What if we find mold in the attic? So my opinion is it would help the whole process. It would speed the whole process up on a pre-listing, but I know you think a little bit different than I do.
Well, let me just tell you how I think. So, and guys, look, I'm not in total opposition of you getting a pre-listing home inspection, but I want you to understand a couple things. The buyers, they're not accepting that. Okay. So if you think you're going to do it in lieu of them getting a home inspection, it's simply not the case. So, we wish, so it's like the bank accepting another appraiser's appraisal. You can't say, well, it's worth this amount of money because we just had it appraised. So the bank's going to have their own appraisal, just so will the buyer have their own home inspector that they hire come through and check it out. But here's some of the concerns from at least, a licensing standpoint, or, a lot of times what happens is if the agent is involved, they have a representation agreement with the seller, and then they're bringing in that home inspector. What happens is the things that are uncovered become what we call as material facts. So if you tell me that there's a defect in the home, then at that point, I have to say, well, now you have to fix it, or we have to disclose it, right? And then what happens is a lot of times people want to just fix it the best way, the most economical way that they possibly can. And a lot of times that's Uncle Eddie or, themselves, or just cover it over and things like that. So, I always kind of, want to go that one step further to say, okay, guys, if we're going to get a pre-listing inspection, we have to really make sure that we're doing the proper job educating, so that we don't get ourselves or our clients worse yet, because, that's where it all starts, right? The buyer gets in there, they realize something was covered up, and then boom, it's coming back. So we've got a couple minutes left here. I want to just talk about, so at least, and I was speaking with a real estate attorney earlier today, a friend of mine, we were just kind of chit-chatting about some current trends, and we started talking about this home inspection process and really what happens when a buyer buys the home, they had a home inspection and something breaks. And so my friend told me, he said, Todd, I field at least one of these calls every single day that they call up and say, hey, I bought the house, I had a home inspection, the window is now leaking every time it rains, and it's going to cost $1,000 to fix it, and we want the $1,000, help us out. What happens, because Tim, I know you said it's a snapshot in time, but what happens when you guys miss something?
Well, the process is pretty much, similar across the board anywhere in the country. If we do an inspection and then we have a client call us and say, hey, I have a leaking window or I have a leaking pipe that wasn't represented on the report, we're going to send that inspector back out, or his manager or representative of the organization, because we want to see it. We want to make sure that we can take any issue that we have as an organization and learn from it, so that hopefully others won't make the same mistake. The reality is, in most areas, there's a limited liability for home inspectors, and that's the return of the fee of what was paid for the inspection. So, if I do an inspection for $400 and I have a $10,000 miss, by law, I only owe you $400. And that's why it's so important to make sure when you pick your home inspector that you pick a company that's established, that stands by their work, that has learned from their mistakes, and it supports their inspectors and the back end product. So, we want to make sure that our clients are happy. The rule of thumb, clients is always right. But we want to do it in a factual manner. And that's why we do a revisit to the property. We assess the situation. As somebody that's involved in the process at the corporate level, there's been many a times where I receive photographs from an individual complaining about a potential issue, and then I'll pull the home inspector's report and compare the two. And a perfect example of that is I had an incident a couple months ago where there was a property that was having electrical issues, and the homeowner contacted us 6 months after we had performed the inspection and asked, for $2,500 to have an upgrade to their electrical panel. Well, when they sent me the photograph, I noticed that the large pine tree that was in the photos of my home inspection was no longer present. And turns out that it had knocked down during a windstorm, had taken off the service mast to the house, which shorted something out in the electrical panel. And they did not hire a professional to reattach the service mast to the house, which then led to more internal issues to the property. And when I got that photograph and I pointed that out and got the whole story, then we understood we didn't do anything wrong, but if we do something wrong, we will stand by. A good home inspection company will stand by their product and support the client and the real estate professional, because inevitably we want, the business to return. That's how we grow and develop wonderful relationships for an extended period of time.
And I think the big takeaway here, guys, and Tim, you did a great job. And as we wrap up here, we thank everybody for watching. And certainly, if you're watching this on YouTube, if you would hit subscribe if you like this content and you want to hear more of it, and hit that bell so that you get alerted when we post. And we're going to make sure that Tim's contact information is in the show notes. The big takeaways here, guys, is really, if you're a buyer, make sure that you're active in hiring your home inspector. Take those recommendations from your agent, but pick up the phone and call them. Let them know where you are in your phase of your purchase. If you're a first-time buyer, make sure that you're connecting and that you're liking what that inspector, you get a good feel communicating with them. Make sure you're there. I mean, now that we're through COVID, A lot of home inspections went, without with the buyer. I think we've learned a lot now, and mask up or whatever, but make sure that you're there, because this is an educational process. So it's really an introduction to your home, to home ownership. And, as Tim and other professionals are introducing you to that home, you should be taking notes and really understanding, what it is that you're buying. And then if you're a seller, understand that when these things, when you're presented with that list, if there is one for, negotiating repairs and things like that, you have to be open-minded to it. In a lot of cases, whether you've been maintaining these homes or not. And, some of these things, that you really shouldn't be that surprised of. And really understand that those items in that home inspection, a lot of times, I know here in Maryland, I won't speak for other states, but they become material facts. And if you decide that you're going to walk away from that deal and not fix things, you have to understand that a lot of times they have to be fixed. So guys, thanks so much for watching tonight. Tim, thank you. Remember, in Maryland here, we can help you directly buy and sell. We're boutique brokerage here in Maryland. And if you're anywhere in the country and you're watching, I can also help you with my wonderful broker network all over the country. You just reach out to me at TS for Todd Sachs at SachsRealty.com, and see you next week.